When you hear the name Ric Flair, you probably think of championship titles, over-the-top charisma, and that unforgettable woo. But the man behind the Nature Boy persona has a complicated legacy. Sure, he's one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time, but outside the ring, Flair's career is filled with controversies, real-life feuds, and plenty of backstage drama. Born on February 25, 1949, this guy's career has spanned over 50 years. Yup, 5 decades of pure wrestling greatness. Known as the Nature Boy, Flair is often called the greatest wrestler of all time by fans, wrestlers, and even journalists. He's wrestled for some of the biggest promotions like Jim Crockett Promotions, WCW, WWE, and TNA. Most of his time was spent with JCP and WCW, where he won a ton of titles and headlined big events like Starrcade, 10 times to be exact. But hey, don't get deceived. Ric Flair also has a bunch of backstage feuds that we're here to cover today. Let's start with something that's hard to hear but important to talk about. Back in the 1980s, when Teddy Long was just starting out in wrestling, he says Ric Flair treated him with hostility and outright racism. Long claims that Flair once walked up to him backstage and called him the N-word and then asked, "You like working here?" According to Long, Flair never apologized, and Long believes Flair hasn't really changed since those days. Flair has never addressed this accusation publicly, but the story stands as a troubling reminder of the challenges many people faced behind the scenes in wrestling's earlier days. You tell us in the comments section, is it okay to be racist? And if this wasn't enough, Ric has another feud. Ric Flair and Bret Hart, 2 absolute legends of wrestling, have a long history of not getting along. Their rivalry wasn't just about matches, it spilled over into interviews, books, and years of very public shade. Back in 1993, Bret gave a radio interview where he said Flair, and I'm quoting here, sucks. He also called Flair's WCW workplace minor league. Flair didn't take that lying down. In his autobiography, Flair accused Bret of using personal tragedies, like his brother Owen's death and the Montreal screwjob, to stay relevant. Brutal, right? Anyway, Bret clapped back, calling Flair's accusations ridiculous. He said Flair's claims about him not being a major draw in the US were flat out wrong, pointing to his sold-out WWF tours. Bret also criticized Flair's wrestling style, saying it was repetitive and that Flair bled too much in matches. Now here's the good news. These two did eventually patch things up. Today, they're on good terms and have nothing but respect for each other. But for a while there, it was brutal. Moving next, the grudge that never ended with Shane Douglas. Shane and Ric Flair. Oh boy, this one gets nasty. Shane had a lot to say about Flair over the years. He used to call him Dick Flair and claimed that Flair sabotaged his career in WCW. Shane believed Flair used his backstage power to hold him back and keep him out of the spotlight. Flair wasn't about to let that slide. During a live internet radio show, Flair fired back, saying Douglas always blamed other people for his failures. He even accused Douglas of using steroids, challenging him to meet him face-to-face if he'd take the needle out of his ass. Unlike some of Flair's other feuds, this one never really got resolved. It's one of those rivalries where both sides just seem to hold on to the bitterness. Next up, we've got Ric Flair and Mick Foley. These two had a professional and personal rivalry that got really heated. Mick criticized Flair's booking decisions during his WCW days, saying Flair wasn't good at handling talent. Flair hit back hard in his book, calling Foley a glorified stuntman. He basically said it didn't matter how many crazy matches Foley did, he would never be on Flair's level. This bad blood even led to a real-life altercation in 2004. But here's the twist. They ended up working together in WWE and had one of the bloodiest matches of Flair's career at SummerSlam 2006. Barbed wire, thumbtacks, the works. It was brutal. These days, they've patched things up and even consider each other friends. It's amazing how wrestling can do that. Now, here's a more recent one, Ric Flair versus Becky Lynch. Back in 2019, Flair filed a trademark for the nickname The Man, which Becky was using during her rise to superstardom. Flair's move caused a lot of tension, even with his daughter Charlotte, who was Becky's rival at the time. Becky kept things classy, saying she still respected Flair, but it was clear the drama wasn't going away. Eventually, Flair transferred the trademark to WWE, and in 2023, he apologized to Becky. That's one feud that ended on a positive note. And finally, we have the plane ride from hell, one of wrestling's most infamous stories. In 2002, Flair was accused of exposing himself to flight attendants and forcing them into uncomfortable situations. The case was settled out of court, but the allegations resurfaced in 2021 on the documentary Dark Side of the Ring. After the episode aired, WWE distanced itself from Flair, even removing him from their intro video. Flair continues to deny the allegations, but it's an incident that remains a black mark on his career. Ric Flair is a complicated figure. On one hand, he's a wrestling legend whose name is synonymous with the sport. On the other hand, his career has been full of feuds, controversies, and personal drama. Love him or hate him, Ric Flair's story is unforgettable and one that fans will be talking about for generations. Keeping his controversy aside, he also has an incredible career. For the real fans, here we have a quick rundown of his epic career. Ric Flair wasn't always the nature boy. He was born Richard Morgan Fleer in 1949, and his path to wrestling was anything but ordinary. Flair trained with legendary wrestler Werner Gagne, and in 1972, he made his debut in the American Wrestling Association. Right away, Flair's charisma stood out, but just a few years into his career, disaster struck. In 1975, Flair was in a plane crash that nearly ended his wrestling journey. He broke his back in 3 places and was told he'd never wrestle again. Most people would have given up, but not Ric Flair. He worked harder than ever to recover, and just a year later, he was back in the ring. That determination would define his career. Flair's rise really started when he adopted his nature boy persona in the late 1970s. He took inspiration from Buddy Rogers, a legendary wrestler before him. Flair made it his own by turning up the volume. Flashy robes, sunglasses, expensive suits, and non-stop bragging about his money, cars, and women. And then there was his catchphrase, "To be the man, you've got to beat the man." Combine that with his in-ring skills, and Flair became a superstar. In 1981, Flair won his first world championship by defeating Dusty Rhodes. That was just the beginning. Flair would go on to win 16 world titles during his career, a record that still stands today. In the 1980s, Flair became the leader of the Four Horsemen, one of wrestling's most famous groups. Alongside Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, and Tully Blanchard, Flair dominated the wrestling scene. The Horsemen were known for their unmatched skill in the ring and their wild antics outside of it. Flair also had some legendary rivalries during this time. He faced off against wrestling icons like Dusty Rhodes, Ricky Steamboat, and Sting. His series of matches with Steamboat in 1989 is still considered some of the best wrestling ever. Flair was the total package. He could wrestle for an hour straight, deliver an amazing promo, and entertain fans like nobody else. In 1991, Flair made a bold move and left WCW to join WWE, then WWF. This was a big deal because Flair was seen as the face of WCW. He even brought his WCW World Heavyweight Championship belt with him to WWE, calling himself the real world champion. Flair didn't waste any time making his mark. At the 1992 Royal Rumble, he won the WWE Championship in one of the best Rumble matches ever. He lasted over an hour, outlasting legends like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and The Undertaker. But Flair's time in WWE was surprisingly short. By 1993, he was back in WCW. Flair's return to WCW came during one of wrestling's most exciting eras, the Monday Night Wars. WCW was battling WWE for ratings, and Flair was one of their biggest stars. He had memorable feuds with Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and the NWO, led by Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall. Flair stayed a key player in WCW, but the company started to fall apart in the late 1990s. By 2001, WCW was sold to WWE, and it seemed like Flair's wrestling career might be over. Flair wasn't done yet. In 2001, he returned to WWE, and fans couldn't have been happier. At first, he played a non-wrestling role, but soon enough, he was back in the ring. Even in his 50s, Flair could still deliver. He became a mentor to younger stars like Triple H, Randy Orton, and Batista as part of the faction Evolution. Flair showed that even though he was older, he was still the man. In 2008, Flair had what was supposed to be his retirement match at WrestleMania 24 against Shawn Michaels. The match was emotional, with Michaels famously saying, "I'm sorry, I love you," before delivering the final move. Flair left the ring in tears, receiving a standing ovation from fans and wrestlers alike. It was the perfect send-off, but Flair didn't stay retired for long. He wrestled a few more matches outside WWE, though they didn't live up to his earlier career. Flair's career wasn't all bright lights and glory. He's had his share of controversies. His real-life feuds with wrestlers like Bret Hart, Mick Foley, and Shane Douglas often made headlines. And then there was the infamous plane ride from hell in 2002, where Flair was accused of inappropriate behavior. Despite these challenges, Flair's impact on wrestling is undeniable. So what's the final word on Ric Flair? He's a complicated figure for sure, but he's also one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. His talent, charisma, and larger-than-life personality made him a star, and his influence can still be seen in wrestling today. Whether you remember him as a champion, a showman, or even a controversial figure, there's no denying Ric Flair's place in wrestling history. After all, as Flair himself says, to be the man, you've got to beat the man.